So good afternoon. Oops, there we go. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle. We're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I would like to thank the Friends of the Museum of the Albemarle. They are our support group that helps make these programs possible for us to have monthly, well, twice a month, and other activities we have here at the museum. So if you would like to become a member, we do have the application out front if you would like to pick one up. Just a reminder, our next History for Lunch will be Wednesday, February the 19th. Dr. Kathleen Duvall, Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, will discuss how North Carolina's men and women responded and contributed to the American Revolution. And that will be held Wednesday, February the 19th at noon. Today, we would like to welcome Dr. Glen Bowman, Professor at Elizabeth City State University. He was also my professor at Elizabeth City State University too. But he will to discuss the history of efforts in the region to restrict voting rights, as well as other efforts to expand suffrage from the beginning of Jim Crow to the election of W. Kerr Scott as governor. Dr. Bowman, I welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. This is a nice crowd. I know we have some people at home on Zoom, and hope you can hear what I have to say. But I know this is lunch, and not everybody has a very long lunch break, so I'm going to start the ball rolling and move quickly. But my topic for today is, what might say, kind of one of the more uncomfortable topics. But if you understand U.S. history, it's definitely worth discussing. And my topic is today disenfranchisement in this region, really, 1899 till 1949. Many ways, 50 years of voter suppression. I think this is a pretty obvious answer. If you've ever been around election time, you know what that is, right? That is a sticker. Sometimes you see that people wear the stickers on the jackets after they voted. Everybody knows what that means. That's an easy question. Here's a more difficult question. What percent of American citizens 18 and over today are ineligible from voting? They are not allowed to vote for whatever reason due to criminal convictions and such. What percentage is it today? May want to take a guess in the audience? Throw out a number for me. 30? Okay, well, that's a little high. Actually, it's only, according to sentencingproject.org, in 2024, it was a little less than 2%, 1.8. People who are legally ineligible to vote, mostly due to felony convictions. And in many states, felons can have their rights regained after their sentence has been served. But this is not really about 2024. This is actually, today, I'm focusing upon 1899 to 1949. And again, this is, to many, an uncomfortable topic, especially for those of us who like to think about the positive. And there's not a lot of positive to talk about when you talk about people not having their rights being honored and having their rights taken away due to really no fault of their own, due to their inherent unchangeable qualities, which was the case. So what I'm going to go about this is I'm going to try to focus on this through 5 different things. I'm going to talk about first the role that UNC Chapel Hill played in this. This may surprise many of you. The actual 1898 political campaign. Sometimes we hear about Wilmington and the Wilmington Massacre in November of that year, but 1898 was a lot more than about Wilmington. After that, briefly, the actual amendment in the state constitution that effectively disenfranchised a vast majority of Black voters and some poor white voters as well. And then we'll continue on through Jim Crow, and we'll end with the pivotal election of W. Kerr Scott, governor of 1949. First thing, UNC. And this is an old picture from the 1890s. And if you've been to the campus, as I have a number of times, campus looks completely different. And in the 1890s, the campus was a lot smaller than it is today. In fact, in many ways, the size was comparable to Mid-Atlantic Christian University. It looked nothing like the metropolis of sorts you see today if you drive out there. And I'm hoping the parking was a lot easier back in the day. Of course, there weren't too many cars around, not too many at all. In fact, you could say that wasn't a problem for students whatsoever. Um, but it was about what was offered at that institution. And there was a very important professor named George Winston, and he was a professor who was actually a mentor to a generation of white supremacist leaders, politicians who found a home in the Democratic Party in North Carolina. It's a picture of Professor Winston. What did he teach? He actually was a graduate of Cornell and he taught literature, but in those days, professors were known more as journalists who could teach a wide variety of topics. So today, if you go to university, a professor of literature teaches only literature. But in those days, even at UNC, professors taught a number of courses that we would say today to be way outside of their range of expertise. He also taught social evolution and a topic that was called racial science, sometimes called ethnology. This essentially was the attempt to bring science into racism. This was scientific racism. He brought in evolution and tried to teach it. And his students were left with the impression that these were revolutionary ideas and that if they applied those to society, they could reshape North Carolina for the better. In 1891, he became president of the institution. And 10 years later, I became president of what is now called North Carolina State University. Again, a very important figure, mentored a generation. And many of these students of his, not all of them, but many of the architects of white supremacy in North Carolina during Jim Crow were students in his courses. They were UNC graduates, and just here's a number of them. And I'm not going to go give you biographies of all of these, but there is a former superintendent of education who served for nearly 2 decades, whose name is on the library at East Carolina University. There are a few other figures who were educators whose names are associated with North Carolina State. A couple governors as well, including Charles Aycock, the so-called education governor. So they were inspired by their courses and they brought it to the state. Where did it all begin? In many ways was the white supremacy campaign of 1898. Now, this is a picture of the man who became mayor of Wilmington. He wasn't elected mayor. He was actually a former congressman named Alfred Raudell. And he's known for the statement, North Carolina is a white man's state and white men will rule it. And this is, I'm not exaggerating. I don't use the phrase white supremacy loosely. Many people today will hear this thrown on cable TV and that's white supremacy and this is white supremacy. This is a term that was embraced and this is how they identified themselves. This is not an exaggeration. The issue was that the Democratic Party was concerned in the 1890s because during the 1890s, Blacks had increasing political power. Many of them held political office. And Democrats resented being out of power. And so they figured out a way to break up this coalition. There was a coalition called Fusion, and that involved Republicans as well as populists, and Black men gravitated to the Republican Party. And so this coalition kept Democrats out of power. So the Democrats thought if we ever find a way to break up this coalition to antagonize people against Blacks, well, then that would end their power. And then that means we could come in that power vacuum and take control of the state. So it was about a campaign in the election that year about scaring the electorate. And you would see cartoons like this in the pages of the News and Observer. And the power was to scare the public into fearing Negro rule. Blacks are out to take your power. They're going to rule you. They're going to dominate you. And then once gained election, use that election as a way to bring in the ideas from Professor Winston at UNC to create kind of a progressive North Carolina, kind of a Wisconsin of the South. In Elizabeth City, speakers came to this town really to stump for white supremacy. That's how they identified themselves. White supremacy clubs and government unions were established in this area. Professor Winston had a strong role in this. His brother Francis did as well. In fact, for this, the governor made Francis, Professor Winston's brother, a judge, and then later on he was elected lieutenant governor. So these were, and if you read the papers at the time, you see announcements for meetings and clubs and such. In this town, Elizabeth City, 200 joined the white government union. That's what it was called. The president was a man named J.B. Lay, who was elected to the state house in 1898. Members also included a future state senator named Roscoe Turner, the longtime city board chair, who is also known as a famous attorney in the Cropsey case, and local school superintendent, whose daughter actually later on became a member of the Elizabeth City State Board of Trustees. Essentially, this was not just here, this was statewide. This was statewide. Now, up before the election, Republicans and Black Republicans knew what was at stake. And a fellow classmate of P.W. Moore, the first principal at what is now ECSU, who actually had his own school in Harford County, issued a warning about the upcoming election. And he warned people that the Democrats sought to abridge the civil liberties of the colored man. And he pleaded with Blacks to stand by the party and to get out and vote. He knew what was happening. He knew he was reading the papers. He knew what was at stake. However, there were a number of that's a word, thugs, it might be a generous way to put it, called the red shirts. Now, this was an idea that first came from South Carolina. Like many things in North Carolina, they started off before in deep South states, including South Carolina, and the red shirts would hang around voting booths, guys with guns, intimidating voters. Of course, trying to scare Black voters from voting in the first place. So you wonder, this person was your neighbor or somebody you knew, and he had a gun and he was looking at you with those kind of eyes. You knew that you had some pressure upon you. This election was a massive program of fraud, intimidation, and violence, ballot box stuffing, and all the dirty tricks you can think about. People being threatened and beaten. This also included a coup d'etat. Now, I'm not going to get into that because this is not the subject, but Wilmington did not have a city government election. Just like in Elizabeth City, the city government is elected in a different year than we have federal elections. And so their election was the year before, but all the excitement about the election just helped create this coup d'etat. They didn't want to wait until the next year for a city election. They wanted change now because their emotions had been completely exploded due to this campaign they read in the papers. Unfortunately, Calvin Scott Brown's appeal failed to stop the landslide, and this was a landslide, a true landslide. 94 out of 120 seats in the state house. That's close to 80% were now Democratic, and 4 out of 5 in the state Senate, so another 80%. So this election, 1898, was the birth of a one-party state in North Carolina that would last a lifetime and beyond. The last man standing was actually Congressman George Henry White. He served in a district that included, I think, part of this area. The maps, as you know, were always changing due to the census, but he was the last Black in Congress. So he was really representing, in many ways, a lot of people far outside his district in North Carolina. It will be the last time that North Carolina would actually have a governor that was not Democratic until 1972. And there would not be a Black to serve in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. until this area elected Eva Clayton in 1992. So let's do the math. 1898, 1992. That's nearly a century. One-party state. Now, these former students at UNC, their platform in shaping North Carolina included, and I have a picture of an octopus because I want to make sure that the tentacles were everywhere. It was encompassing. It wasn't just about politics. This included segregation. This included public health changes, eugenics, which was actually fairly big in this area due to the publication of the Independent newspaper. The editor was very much center stage on that. As historians Gregory Downs points out, progressive statism was therefore born within white supremacy. That's the case in North Carolina. Now, after the election of 1898, there was still the issue of what about future elections? So after the election, there was a push to change the state constitution in order to keep Blacks from voting not just in 1900, but beyond. This was an effort to modify the state constitution. And you just see some of the cartoons. The fear was black power, and we need to club it and knock it down before it takes over the state. In 1900, this referendum was about keeping the election of 1898 for good. It was about the Democratic Party not being able to lose power. And they kept black voters out, then they would remain in power forever. And as we saw, they almost did. Disenfranchisement was a key social reform because it was about progress. And they looked at this as keeping the ballot box clean. And this was the words that were used at the time, from unprogressive races. That included blacks and immigrants, especially those Eastern European immigrants that speak languages that we don't understand. Ignorant whites, that was what was used at the time. That's not me commenting. That's commenting on what people were saying back in that time. Voting was for only Anglo-Saxon men. And this wasn't hidden because it was believed that only Anglo-Saxon men were evolutionarily, on an evolutionary scale, ready for government. Those other races were not ready in terms of evolution, in terms of this misapplication of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. They weren't ready to vote yet. Then you had the Spanish-American War and all that going on to create this powder keg of sorts. Not to criticize only the South in this, but up north, many times, many states passed minimum wage laws. They were geared and they were put in place to keep immigrants from taking jobs. And again, I'm not going to get into that all, but believe me, if you read the literature, you understand. So it's not just a North Carolina thing. This was, in many ways, a nationwide thing. And of course, the question is, how can you change the Constitution without violating the federal Constitution? And you think, well, this is kind of strange. Why would the Democratic Party want to reduce democracy? It seems like a contradiction of names here. But that was the puzzle, and how could they do it? Because they realized that they couldn't create an amendment that would go against the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War. And that included all these things, including the Citizenship Clause, the Due Process Clause, Equal Protection Clause. North Carolina just couldn't write anything they wanted to write. They had to make certain that this would pass constitutional muster. It would have to pass the Supreme Court if need be. So they figured it out. They had the idea of a literacy test with a catch. Here is the catch. Illiterates would be allowed to vote if they or their ancestors had been registered before 1867. If they registered before 1908, this meant that no whites could be disenfranchised, even if they were illiterate. And that meant that no black could be grandfathered in because blacks could not vote until, guess when? 1867. That's a loophole. And that's a grandfather clause. Hey, how did they get away with this? I mean, this seems so sinister. This seems so devious. Well, the amendment made no mention of race or ethnicity. They just added this clause that essentially referred only to those who were blacks, but they didn't mention race or ethnicity, and so that meant that this was not going to be receiving the attention it may have otherwise received. George Henry White knew what was going on. He was strident. He spoke vociferously. He said that disenfranchisement would blunt our aspirations, ruin our manhood, and would lessen our usefulness as citizens. He spoke out against it. But during this referendum in 1900, the Redshirt came back to intimidate voters. Alfred Moore Waddell, the illegitimate mayor of Wilmington, told whites that if they found a black man voting, they should tell him to leave. He refuses, quote unquote, kill him, shoot him down. Despite those threats, 2/3 of blacks on the voting rolls voted anyway, despite that threat. Literally a death threat from an acting mayor of what was the largest city in the state. Please note that this clause also intimidated poor whites. Many whites thought there was going to be some loophole that was going to get them. They didn't like the literacy test thing after 1908. But the campaign supporters kept pushing. Gubernatorial candidate Charles Aycock, one of those who went to Chapel Hill in the early 1880s, denounced whites who opposed the amendment, considered those whites public enemies who deserved contempt. On August 2nd, there was a referendum, and this was, as you might expect, filled with fraud. In one ward in this area, less than half of the black votes were even counted, since the election board kept on challenging the voters. And that meant voters couldn't get to vote because every time a black voted, they were challenging that. And that kept the line not moving. In one other word, only one Republican ballot made it to the box before the polls, just like that, closed. So the deal was kind of delaying tactics, keep people waiting in line. Maybe they'd get frustrated and go home because they're hungry or tired from working out in the fields all day. In Harford County, Republican candidate Meekins received only 2 votes, while incumbent Democratic candidate Small received 1,405. Something's a little shifty with that because Hertford County has a large number of black citizens. It's an agricultural county, so you can presume that more than 2 blacks or other Republicans wanted to vote that day. And so essentially what this was like, it was a fraud of an election. You might as well have stuck the ballots in the trash because that's essentially what they were doing. Many of them didn't get a chance to vote. But yet it stood. Statewide, the referendum passed 59-41. The grandfather clause, literacy test, plus a poll tax. See, the poll tax was there to keep poor whites from voting as well. It wasn't just about disenfranchising blacks. It was also about keeping those whites who we can't trust because they may ally themselves with blacks because of similar socioeconomic background, keep them from voting as well. So what this amendment did was allow Democrats to create a one-party Jim Crow state. And right after the election of 1898, the first Jim Crow law in the state, segregation on railways and steamships. People used to have to go on a steamship if they wanted to go to Norfolk. Imagine that long, long trip. Segregation, and then it went on from there in other areas. Now, this affected public schools, obviously, and you think, well, how so? Well, if blacks only made up a small percentage of voters, what's the incentive to improve their schools? Because voters won't make them accountable because there will not be many black voters. So why put anything in the black schools? I mean, and because of this literacy test that was now going to be in play, starting really in 1908, white children needed to be literate so they could pass these tests, presumably. So that meant that the school system was, especially the normal schools, and other schools, the higher education was about different goals. White schools were focused more on academic education, which meant that black institutions, including the one we have down the road here, on Southern Avenue, focused a lot of times on industrial education, practical skills, not academic skills. That meant new teacher training schools for whites because white children would need to pass these literacy tests starting in 1908. So that meant that the state took over white normal schools in Boone and Cullowhee, and later opened up one in Pitt County. All 3 of these schools still exist today. They're part of the UNC system. Western Carolina, Appalachian State, East Carolina University. These are all created or bought or created after the amendment because they needed to have teacher training schools to have teachers in white schools so white children could pass the tests when it was time to vote. Meanwhile, the same General Assembly passed an act for the consolidation and government of the color normal schools, which of course included the one we have in town here. The state gave the State Board of Education the authority to close or move black normal schools as they saw fit. So what happened is, as you might have guessed already, the money for black schools started to dry up. And sometimes the state completely ran out of funds because it was not a legislative priority. The state was ended up going to have to close some of these black normal schools. People sometimes forget that there at one time were 7 black normal schools here in North Carolina. 4 became 3, and then 7 became 4, 4 became 3. These 3 still exist today. ECSU, Fayetteville State, Winston-Salem State. There were other ones. There was one in Plymouth, there was one in Salisbury, there was one in Franklinton. Those were closed. Now, going on from there, the aftermath. So even worse than a really bad Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. The aftermath was also bad. Just to see an example here, here's a 1902 voter registration card. And if you read it carefully, if you can see that, you notice here that that 1867 date is on there. So this person could presumably vote without having to prove any literacy whatsoever, because he was born, his ancestors were born in the right year. Now, let's look at the data here. And I know you probably can't see all this very clearly, but this was done by the News and Observer in 1902. And this is all done by county. And I'm not going to go through it county by county. My goodness, this is lunchtime. But this was evident. And I want to just show you a few things here, some of the highlights, so you don't have to read this with your glasses. Out of a voting age population of nearly 241,000, in other words, 241,000 registered voters in 1902, only 6,000 of them were African American. That meant in Pasquotank County, there were 105 Black voters out of over 1,000. You know, the population at the time, it was not that way at all. The 1900 census, African Americans made up nearly 1/3 of the population, and yet they comprise only less than 3%, about 2.6% of the voting registered list. In 1880, they made up nearly 2 out of 5 of the total population. Now, that was down to about 1 out of 3 because many Blacks decided that they couldn't get a fair shake here in North Carolina. So they went up north. They moved to cities such as St. Louis, Philadelphia, Detroit, Gary, Indiana, Boston, and so on, because here they couldn't get a chance to even vote. I mean, what's the point of living in a state where someone's telling you what to do? You can't even tell them what you would like to do, have them do. In 1896, this is a stunning figure, 87% of eligible Black voters cast a ballot. That is pretty good turnout. Of course, that went down to almost nothing. Disenfranchisement is how North Carolina became a one-party state. And obviously, a one-party state can't be a democracy, even if it's run by the Democratic Party. And please note, this was not something that people were ashamed of. This was really a point of pride. People like Charles Aycock and others like him thought they were doing the right thing. It's not as if they went to their deathbed embarrassed and asking for forgiveness. They thought they had done right. They thought they had made North Carolina go in the direction of progress. 1919, the poll tax was eliminated in North Carolina as a requirement for voting. Many states kept the poll tax for a lot longer than that. But it was still a revenue source until 1971. But it was no longer after 1919 a way to keep people from voting. You could still vote even if you hadn't paid the poll tax at that moment. They didn't disqualify you if you hadn't paid it at the moment. One thing North Carolina did not do during this time was the all-white primary. Some states actually did this. They allowed the election, of course, by federal law to be open to all. But the primaries are run by the party. And some states actually had an all-white primary. There you go. So the whites have the primary, and of course, whoever won the primary won the election. That's how it went in North Carolina, which was now a one-party state. It was not until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that the legislative legacy of this deplorable amendment would finally end. But there was some evidence of progress, and I'm going to leave you here on a little bit of a positive note here. Governor W. Kerr Scott. The Scott name is actually kind of rather famous, or maybe even infamous, because of not W. Kerr Scott, but another Scott. I'm not going to get into that all, but Governor W. Kerr Scott marks a watershed in this process. In previous decades, this had been a long time since 1900. The Democratic Party machine had a rule, an unwritten rule, that when it came to governor, it alternated between regions, east one time, west another. So 1928, it was the Eastern's time, and that's why John Ehrenhaus became governor in 1928. 1932, it was the Western half. 36 east, 40 west, 44 east. That meant 48 should be west. Scott was from the east. Scott did not follow this. He ran anyway for primary. But meanwhile, in the 1940s, the number of Black voters did increase in North Carolina. Now, it did not increase in all states. It did not increase in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana, but it did increase in the 1940s. In general, they voted in the primary for Scott because Scott was kind of going against the machine, because he was bucking the trend. He was told, don't run because it's not your turn. It's the Western half's turn, not the Eastern half. He didn't care. He wanted to run anyway. He actually advertised in Black newspapers, such as Lewis Austin's Carolina Times. He finished second in the primary, but as you know how the rules are in North Carolina, you can finish second in the primary and still win the election. And so he did. So when he won the election in 1948, he felt an obligation to pay back his Black supporters in the election. What did he do? He appointed many to state government positions. He increased appropriations for Black institutions such as Elizabeth City State Teachers College. He supported campaigns in Eastern North Carolina for increased Black suffrage. He also appointed former president of Elizabeth City State Teachers College, Harold Leonard Trigg, to the State Board of Education. He was the first Black to be on that board. And I've actually seen the letters that Scott received from some angry voters who did not like him appointing a Black man in that position. There weren't that many, but there were enough, and none of them really, none of them look good on the author, I should say. But there was some outrage, but not all that much as I thought there would be. He also desegregated the Elizabeth City State Teachers College Board of Trustees. Even though the school was founded in 1891, the Board of Trustees had been completely an all-white body ever since then. You think about it. It's like 1948, 1949, that was 58 years. Black institution, all-white trustees. Scott decided to change that. He appointed a campus physician, Dr. E.F. Hoffler, and the Reverend Howard Mitchell, who was a farmer from Gates County. Now, here's the thing about it. The Daily Advance in the election supported Charles Johnson in the primary because he was from the Western half. The Daily Advance supported the Democratic Party machine. The Daily Advance editor, Herbert Peel, did not support Kerr Scott. So when Kerr Scott won, he was going to pay back some of his non-supporters. Herbert Peel's only surviving son, named Thomas, was on that board. I think it was Mitchell got the position that Thomas Peel had held. So what he did is he removed the newspaper editor's son and then put a Black man. So those are the first two Black trustees in the history of the institution. See, elections have consequences, and that meant the end. And again, these are paying positions. People were paid to do this. These are nice, comfortable positions. And so now they were two Black men on that board. And I know this is lunch and I could go on longer and longer, but for sake of time, I am done. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Oh, Jim Crow, it's almost like a mythical figure. It was not a real person, but you see Jim Crow depicted in a cartoonish way, but it was just kind of like Uncle Sam. I mean, not a real person named Jim Crow, but it became an expression that was associated with this kind of political movement. Yes. Because I teach at ECSU and I write the history of ECSU, and this has come up in my research because I saw how this affected the history of the institution. Uh, I said I'm kind of the campus's unofficial historian. People have questions, they ask me, and I try to publish articles and such. But it came up, and many other things have come up, and I try to flesh those out sometimes during these kind of presentations in the community. But there's so much I have to still deal and like to talk about in the future. But it came up in my research because you understand voting dictates how schools get funded. Yeah.
Massive immigration early 1850s. A lot from Ireland.
Yes.
A lot of Irish came.
Correct.
And how did that affect them? Because their ancestors weren't like here.
I don't know how that affected. They were not seen as Anglo-Saxon per se, and that was I guess in many ways it was kind of seen as a case-by-case basis. I don't see anything in the literature that suggests that Irish immigrants were by 1898 were disenfranchised.
But when they got here, that's still a long period of time. But for a large group of people immigrated here.
Well,
mhm.
I'm not familiar as much with the voting before this period, before Reconstruction. So I don't want to say anything, but I will say this is that historically most states restricted the suffrage. Many states had property requirements for voting and such. So that disqualified many people, regardless of color, if they did not meet those property requirements. Voting was seen historically in U.S. history as something that was only for those who had proven themselves through astuteness in business and other kinds of things. It was a very small percentage. I mean, a small fraction. And of course, no women until 1920.
No, in fact, like between the after the American Revolution up until this time, because they did have those poll taxes and they were arguing about citizenship and who could actually vote. And a lot of people that fought, my ancestors too, black
Sure.
and white,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't get the right to vote.
No.
White ones didn't get the right to vote until late 1850s, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then my black ancestors, well, that wasn't really until 1967.
Yeah. It really varied. And I would say this, that, for example, in North Carolina, before about 1832, free blacks could actually vote in North Carolina. Free blacks were seen as kind of higher status. They were not enslaved. They could vote. They didn't vote a whole lot, but they could vote. Many of them owned property. Many of them owned a lot of property. Many of them became leaders of sorts. And then around 1832, North Carolina eliminated that as well. Pardon?
Vote because they were business
Correct.
owners, they were wealthy, but the other free ones could vote.
And I will say that in this county, even during this disenfranchisement, there were some prominent blacks in this area who did vote. For example, the Shannon family is a very famous name in this county, and Irving Shannon in 1962 became the first black justice of peace. Since Reconstruction, the Shannon family, I've seen their names on the voting rolls in this area, even during this period, from what we know. I hope that answered it a little bit. Wish I could answer it more thoroughly for you. Other questions? Yes. Well, as I said, people are not disqualified for voting to the degree that they were, and many times people who are disqualified for voting per se, but I don't like making those kind of comparisons because this disenfranchised the vast majority, not just a couple percentage, this disenfranchised an entire body who was very instrumental in the state's economy, who went to war and who died in war. who shed the same color blood as anybody else, and yet many of them did not have the right to vote. I don't like making those kind of comparisons, and I'm not claiming any expertise on 2024 political issues. I'm a historian. I try to focus on what I can control and know, and that is documents and from the past. But in terms of power, I think it's very clear that whoever controls the voting has a lot of power, and who gets the most people out to the polls will ultimately win elections in a democratic system. And parties do have incentives to try to game the system through their own kind of electoral shenanigans, just like they did back in 1898 and 1900. But the scope is nothing compared to what it was. I mean, we don't have people with guns standing at the polls looking at you and I know where you live. We don't have that. And thank goodness we don't. Well, I hope they're not. I hope they're not. I hope they're not. And I'm sure some people are intimidated and afraid to vote. And that's a shame. In terms of being disqualified because of race, essentially that is not at all the same problem. But I'm not going to talk more because it's not my thing. I'm not a political scientist. Political scientists might be able to talk about it a lot more detail than I would, and I don't want to. But I don't like making those comparisons because this was horrendous. I mean, the vast majority lost the right. Only a handful in certain counties. Some counties, if you looked at that Louisiana Observer article, they had zero. Now, their county, of course, weren't too many at the beach. We understand that, but some counties, you're looking at a handful, nearly less than 10 people. And you knew there were a lot more out in the fields who were actually working, doing backbreaking jobs and barely eking out a living. And yet they could not go to the polls and to help determine who gets to make those policies that affected them every day on the workplace. Hope that helps answer your question. Other questions? Yes.
How did North Carolina react to the Voting Rights Act of '65?
Not as badly as some other states did. Again, it really depended which parts of the state. Historically, when it came to voting rights, the parts of the country that had a higher percentage of blacks living and working were the ones that had the most resistance. The voting rights, you see the most pullback, of course, in the Deep South, as you might expect, because simply numerically, there were far more blacks as a percentage of the population than there were in Western North Carolina, not too many. Eastern North Carolina, it really did vary, and I don't want to give any kind of generalization here, but North Carolina had its issues, but it was better than, in general, many of the states. For example, West Virginia did not do this scheme at all. They did not have any disenfranchisement. And West Virginia is, as you know, kind of a border state, but it's different. Whereas the Deep South, absolutely. But by the 1940s, especially in North Carolina, there was an increase in black voters, and they're the ones that gave W. Kerr Scott the nod. And they're the ones who try to elect Frank Graham to the Senate in 1950. And that's a whole other story in itself, because Frank Graham was UNC president. He was progressive. And I've seen the letters, I've seen the notes on that. But it really, in terms of the parts of the state, in parts of the South, there's not anything I can't answer that with any kind of precision, because North Carolina is a diverse state, as we all know. Other questions? Yes, Professor.
Dr. Bowman, they helped me to understand the poll tax. Did everybody pay? The poll, I'm talking about blacks and whites. Did
Everybody paid, but if you were poor, it was a larger percentage of your income. And if you're poor and you can't even pay your utilities, you have money to fix the roof that's leaking. You don't have enough money to go to the doctor or dentist because your teeth are falling out. You say, and the poll tax also discourage people, because when you have a one-party system, you think, why vote? Why vote? Because they're going to win anyway. I mean, the game is rigged. If you believe in your heart the game is rigged against you because you know it is, because it's in the rules itself, why would you waste your time paying money for something that really, in the end, you feel will do no good? Did these laws demoralize blacks? Absolutely. Absolutely. But I talked about this last February about this professor at ECSU, we call now ECSU, who analyzed black voting, and people were just demoralized. They didn't think it was worth their time. And it was a rigged system. It was a rigged system. And again, until the Voting Rights Act, it was still a rigged system. And if you read the papers, you will see that in the eastern part of North Carolina, yes, there were some issues. Absolutely.
I always thought that it was levied on blacks. And they were the only ones that paid, but I couldn't understand that in light of the 15th Amendment.
No,
So
no,
it's
no,
levied on
no.
everybody.
No, correct. Everybody had to pay it, but it was cumbersome on poor people too. And the elites in the state didn't want poor people voting either.
Right.
Because poor whites could vote in a way that would contradict what the elites wanted to do. Because you see how this elite system with the UNC kind of shaped the state. That they thought that they were the best to be in charge, and they really were completely confident that their vision was the best vision for the state. And we go back look now and see their hubris, and it astounds us. Okay, these are great questions, and glad I can answer at least part of most of these. But I like the critical thinking here going on. Anybody else? I appreciate this. This is a really great crowd. I'm glad that you came out today. I hope I answered your questions. I hope you learned something, and I hope you attend other things that we have on campus. We have some other Black History events on campus, including I'm leading a historic walking tour of the part of campus that's back in the day on the 12th and the 24th at 12 o'clock. We will meet on the steps of Lane Hall, the old part of Lane Hall, the part that faces H.L. Trigg. So the 12th and the 24th, but I invite you to come to campus, invite you to come see some basketball games, invite you to not be a stranger.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Thank you. Hey, can you